One American woman interviewed on the street that evening stated simply, "We fear this." Giving the Americans no time to catch up, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 in November of 1957. But instead of simply repeating their recent success, the Russians made Sputnik 2 into another first by carrying a living payload into the heavens. The first being to travel to outer space was a female Samoyed terrier named Laika. For its time, Sputnik 2 was a rather intricate life support system. Designed for a 7-day flight, Laika's pressurized cabin allowed only enough room for her to lie down or stand. She could not, however, turn around. An oxygen generator, regulator, and a carbon dioxide absorption device provided Laika with an internal atmosphere. Food and water were injected directly into the dog's stomach via a surgically implanted tube. Waste was removed via another tube. Sensors, including a crude television monitor, kept track of Laika's health and movement. Despite being locked in her compartment 4 days prior to launch, Laika survived her liftoff from Earth, and once in space, her heart rate returned to normal. Laika the space dog was taking the ride of her life, and the Soviets couldn't be happier. But while they reveled in their ability to launch a living being into space, they kept quiet their inability to safely retrieve their brave test subject from the stars until after her launch. While Laika had proven a living being's ability to survive launch and sustain spaceflight, the equipment designed to sustain her life was not up to snuff. 5 to 7 hours after launch, sensors from Sputnik 2 indicated a devastating rise in temperature and humidity within the dog's cabin. The physiological sensors were no longer returning data. It became clear that Laika had perished. The capsule containing Earth's first living visitor to space remained in orbit for a total of 162 days before burning up in the atmosphere upon re-entry. After Sputnik 1, Wernher von Braun and his team were immediately set to work on the Explorer project, intended to send an American satellite into space. Their first attempt to launch ended in an explosion of the satellite while still on the launch pad. Von Braun pointed out that America's first satellite weighed a mere 4 pounds, an insignificant amount when compared to the Soviets' 196-pound Sputnik 2. "We're competing only in spirit," said von Braun. His disappointment, however, would not last for long. By January of 1958, the tides began to turn in the race for space when the U.S. successfully launched Explorer 1.
The National Science Foundation announced that as part of the U.S. International Geophysical Year program, a scientific Earth satellite was placed in orbit at 5 seconds after 10:55 p.m. by means of a Jupiter-C rocket vehicle launched by the Army at Cape Canaveral, Florida. A similar statement is being issued by the President. I should like to add my personal congratulations to the Army Ballistic Missiles Agency and to Dr. von Braun and Dr. Pickering and their colleagues for a job well done.
This diminutive satellite carried a scientific payload that, in short course, discovered a series of magnetic radiation belts circling the Earth. While not a glamorous discovery, it served as a stepping stone in the birth of scientific satellite exploration. 1958 in America also saw the birth of the National Aeronautics and Space Act that ultimately led to the creation of from parts of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and other related government agencies. In response to the seeming success of the rocket on December 13, 1958, inside the rocket, the world's first monkey knot. Gordo, a delightful little squirrel monkey, was reported to have done well during the flight. However, after a successful re-entry, Gordo drowned in the Atlantic Ocean when the rocket's flotation device failed and the spacecraft sank. Next, 2 monkeys named Abel and Baker rode into the heavens in May of 1959. Both returned and were retrieved successfully. And then there was Ham, probably America's most famous monkey knot. Launched into suborbital flight on January 31st, 1961, he flew in a Mercury spacecraft from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Ham experienced roughly 7 minutes of weightlessness during his flight. While in flight, Ham performed some simple tasks, such as pulling a right-hand lever. The experiment was designed so that he could experience a number of anomalies from night for all of mankind. But just a few days later, the glimmer of hope that Gagarin expressed in his letter was overshadowed by a clash on the coast of Cuba. The Bay of Pigs, an attempt by the American military and the Central Intelligence Agency to topple the communist regime of Fidel Castro, ended in defeat and humiliation for the American government and ultimately for the American people. Morale in the land of freedom was now at an all-time low. Despite the emotional climate in the U.S. in May of 1961, President Kennedy held the perfect trump card in his pocket. It seems that even while the Russians continued to beat the Americans on every front in space, the Americans had a secret goal. The primary focus for the space program all along had been to be the first to put a man on the moon. Kennedy had been willing to take his lumps early on, confident that his ultimate goal would be achieved within the decade. To place a manned spacecraft in orbital flight around the Earth, investigate man's performance capabilities and his ability to function in the environment of space. Recover the man and the spacecraft safely. These were the objectives laid out by the American space program for Project Mercury. America's first man in space program set in motion in October of 1958. At this early point in the U.S. space program, many questions remained. Could a human perform as a pilot, engineer, explorer, and experimenter in the unforgiving conditions of space? If the answer was yes, what type of people could actually stand up to the challenge? To answer that question, a special NASA committee was designated to evaluate potential candidates for the Mercury program. The committee received and screened more than 500 service records of a group of talented test pilots, from which 110 candidates were put together. Eventually, the NASA selection committee trimmed this group down to 32 candidates. Each candidate endured harsh physical and mental examinations, including total body x-rays, pressure suit tests, cognitive exercises, and a series of intimidating personal interviews. Out of the 32 candidates undergoing testing, just 18 were chosen as very real possibilities for the program. At a press conference on April 9, 1959 in Washington, D.C., NASA introduced the Mercury 7 to the American public.
Today we are introducing to you and to the world these 7 men who have been selected to begin training for orbital space flight. Which of these men will be first to orbit the Earth, I cannot tell you. He won't know himself until the day of the flight. The astronaut training program will last probably 2 years. During this time, our urgent goal is to subject these gentlemen to every stress, each unusual environment they will experience in that flight.
Called astronauts, as ballooning pioneers had been called argonauts, pilots Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grissom, Schirra, Shepard, and Slayton were thrust into the public eye. 7 Americans willing to risk their lives in the name of science, exploration, and freedom. Project Mercury introduced the world to a new kind of celebrity. Now, the pride of an entire nation lay on the shoulders of these 7 brave pilots.